In some of his writings, the philosopher Spinoza comes across as something of a, a pantheist. He seems to be finding God everywhere. I think the poet Novalis actually refers to him as a God-intoxicated poet or a God-intoxicated man, something like that. But I think there's certainly an argument to be made, and I know it has been made elsewhere, I'll try and find a reference, that Spinoza isn't really pantheistic at all, but his approach is generally sort of proto-scientific, if you like. He seems to be certainly respectful of and fascinated by and inordinately interested in the natural world, but doesn't seem to have pantheistic leanings at all, really. And the distinction, really, which is the distinction that's been found in Spinoza's own writings, is to do with the attitude one should take towards nature, towards the natural world. And as I think I've said elsewhere, Spinoza says that the pantheistic approach, you know, how one would approach the natural world if God was, you know, embedded in every cell and every atom of that world. The appropriate approach would be one of worshipful awe, he says. And he also says that for himself, that's not the approach he wants to take. In fact, he is quite derogatory of that approach. He says it's like standing stupidly and dumbfounded in front of nature, rather than being equal to the task of approaching nature as a kind of equal, and of feeling unashamed and unembarrassed to probe nature and to sort of lovingly investigate it. He says that's for him a more appropriate task, or a more appropriate approach. One of the interesting things I think that throws up is the distinction between a pantheistic understanding of nature and Spinoza's understanding of nature, which is not pantheistic, at least not in any conventional sense. The difference for Spinoza, and I think for others too actually, is purely dispositional. It's purely to do with the cognitive and the emotional attitude one has to the natural world. You know, if that attitude, that disposition, is one of worshipful awe, then you're a pantheist, and nature is the pantheist nature. If one doesn't have that, if one has a much more scientific or rational, let's say, disposition towards nature, then that's not it's not pantheistic. It's much more like atheistic or some other version of that. What's important there, I think, is that the difference between these two approaches doesn't lie in nature at all. It's exactly the same nature. The only difference is in the approach, is in the disposition of the viewer, of the individual embedded within that nature. So, you know, whether God is imbricated firmly into the fabric of nature or not is completely irrelevant in that distinction. Nature stays the same. It's entirely within the body and the mind of the individual, whether that's a pantheistic nature or not.